Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist and ghost lady of PA, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this wonderful day before Memorial Day?
I am doing beautiful. The weather's wonderful. I've spent time with my family, all those great little grandchildren that I talk about. And I'm looking forward to coming back to podcasting. I've missed everybody.
And I've missed our little chats we've had too. So I'm happy that you are back. And this is where I would go through the normal stuff that if you aren't subscribed, please consider clicking the subscribe button. Click that thumbs up like so that we know that you appreciate what we're doing. And in the description, you'll find all the information about the Paranormalist podcast, including links to our Facebook groups, Patty's blog, Patty's books on Amazon, our email address where you can give us feedback, things like that. And with that, I'm going to say, what's our topic for today?
Well, today we're just going to ease our way into it with a few ghost stories, but I have some wonderful stuff coming up down the pike. But at the end of the day, I think I just needed a day of ghost stories, if you all don't mind.
Fine by me.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. So just so our folks know, it's been a busy time in my life, and we've been struggling with a whole bunch of other stuff going on. So we're trying to work our way through learning a whole new process. So things look a little different. That's the reason why. And let's start with a few really good ghost stories. So the first one I wanted to tell is a story of a gentleman by the name of Captain Joseph White. Now, Captain White was, as his name implied, a sea captain. He retired. He was 82 years old. This would have been in the 1800s and 1830, I believe. And Captain White was a very well-to-do man. He made a good fortune there. On the sea, and he lived with his niece. Her name was Mary Beckford, and she was about 45. He had a housekeeper named Lydia Kimball, who was his domestic servant named Ben White, who was a distant relative, and he was kind of like the house's handyman. Now, Beckford's daughter, that was his niece's daughter, so it would have been his great niece. Her name was Mary. And she had been part of the household until she had married a gentleman by the name of Joseph Knapp and moved a few miles down the road to Wenham. This is all taking place in Salem area, Salem, Massachusetts. And we're going to pick up the story here. So those are our characters. Now, one morning, the domestic servant came into the house, and Benjamin White, and he went upstairs to wake up the master, who was Joseph, and Joseph was late, and Joseph was that kind of guy that was so punctual, like he was never late for anything. So the fact that he was still in bed at like 6 o'clock in the morning just seemed very odd. So the servant went upstairs to wake him up and found a horrific scene. He had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death in his bed. Now, everybody in the area knew that Benjamin White, or that Joseph White, had a little chest of gold, and he had lots of wealth. He was a very well-to-do man, and he immediately went to look for this chest, and it was still there, and the gold was still in it. So they summoned the police, and thus begins what becomes a really interesting murder. Eventually, a guy by the name of Richard Crowenshield, who had really no contact with the White family at all, and he and his brother were in a bar. They were drinking in their cups a bit, and they began to brag that they had murdered this guy for his money. And they get arrested. Now, Richard, his brother tells the police that Richard was the guy who contracted to do this murder, and he just came along to kind of help pilfer the wealth. And that the guy woke up in the middle of the night when they were robbing him, and they hit him on the head, knocked him back onto the bed, and then began to stab him. He was stabbed, I believe, something like 17 times.
Oh my.
It was vicious. But there's no history between these two guys, this Richard Crownshield and Mr. White. So the police were struggling with making a motive because he didn't take the gold. So they arrest the two brothers and they take them to jail. And Richard realizes this is going to be capital punishment. So he tells this bizarre story about how he had made a contract with Joseph Jenkins Knapp. Joseph Knapp, that was the grand niece's husband, and that Knapp's brother had initiated the contact and had said that his brother wanted this old man killed because he could inherit the fortune. Eventually, it would come to light that the Crownshields had stole a will out of the box. That was all they took, because the idea was that if he took the will, then everybody would inherit equally. The problem is Mr. White was a very fastidious man, and so he had a will, an old will he kept in the box, but the actual will that was in force at the time wasn't even in the house. He had left it with his attorney. So it thwarted the whole thing. So eventually Crownshield and his brother are arrested. Knapp and his brother are arrested for, their part in the crimes, and everybody ends up either going to jail or being executed. And the house does end up in Mrs. Knapp's hands and her mother's hands. And it turns out that a lot of it was left to Benjamin, the servant, who had been her distant relative. And for some reason, Joseph White had decided that this man had earned it. So he gave a good portion of the fortune to this gentleman here. So everybody got a little something, but it certainly did not work out the way they wanted. Now, that said, the house, still exists. And this is where the haunting picks up. So after this gruesome murder, people began to say that they saw the house got shut down and they saw lights in the house. They saw a figure with a lantern or a lamp or a candle, depending on who tells you the story. There were screams. There were, thumping noises. There was something that felt like there was a tumbling down the stairs, all kinds of craziness. Not a whole lot of which actually fit the murder itself, but it was fascinating. And to this day, the house is still exists and is on occasion occupied, and the house still has this insane haunting. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is that this house and this murder that caused this old man to be so restless actually influenced Edgar Allan Poe to write The Telltale Heart. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a story based upon this murder. Daniel Webster, the prosecuting attorney at the time, became the defense attorney for the Knapp brothers. It just has a lot of history to it. And interestingly enough, it's just never died down at all. And it's a fascinating historical piece when you look at it. And the upshot of it is that to this day, Mr. White is supposedly haunting the house, and people continue to see lights moving through the house and all sorts of interesting bits and pieces. People who work there, they talked about the house, being filled with the sounds of murder before dawn, stuff like that. They would hear the sounds of the murder being redone. And I just thought it was a really fascinating story to share to start us off on this interesting little tale. So that's our first little stop along the way. And the next stop is going to be a little more modern. So in the mid-1990s, this story was told by a gentleman by the name of, I'm just going to call him Robert. He was a paramedic in a little West Texas town. And the strange happening that occurred to him and his partner was something that we've heard, I'm sure, several times before in venues. Basically, it was a regular normal night. Robert's working as paramedic on a unit. They get a call to go to this particular residence because the somebody there was having a heart attack. And as they're driving along, they're thinking there's something familiar about this. There's something familiar about this. Now, you and I might think a heart attack call would be like something very, very memorable. If you're a paramedic, it happens all the time. You may get dozens of them between, in a month. So even though it's slightly memorable, it's not necessarily like it would be for you or I. So they're driving along and they're thinking, man, this is vaguely familiar. So they get closer and they have the lights and the sound and the whole 9 yards going, and it accidentally ends up in the wrong driveway. And I'm sure that happens all the time because, you're looking for sights in the middle of the night. And as they're going down the road, the guy that's driving with Richard, he says, God, dude, do you recognize this place? Isn't this where that old guy had a heart attack like a couple months ago? And Richard's like, yeah, it might be the same residence. Maybe it's a neighbor. When they finally find it is the same house. So Richard says to him, he says, it's got to be the wife. The wife's having a heart attack now. And to be honest with you, that often happens. Somebody passes away and then their spouse of like 40 or 50 years passes away a few weeks later. So they go in the house, they find her, they start working, and all of a sudden the ambulance lights and sirens and stuff kick back on. And Richard looks at his buddy and he's like, I thought we turned that all off. He's like, we did turn it all off. I don't know what's going on. So he goes out and he flips everything off as soon as he can find a free moment. He picks up the gurney and takes it with him, and he goes back inside and they're loading her onto the gurney and everything starts going off again. And they're like, there's got to be a malfunction. That's all I can think of. I mean, the floodlights, the strobe lights, interior lights, everything gets on. The sounds are going, the lights on the outside. It's just massively chaotic. So they get her into the ambulance. She is stable. It's not an emergency call in that respect. And so they get her into the ambulance and they turn everything off and they start to leave and everything turns itself on again. So they get her to the hospital. They do everything they need to. And they said to their, when they got back to the base unit, they said, hey, there might be some malfunction with our lights. And a couple of days later, they're told everything's fine. They found nothing wrong. And he said, I know it sounds crazy, but from the very moment it began, I really think it was her husband telling her she needed help and trying to get us to pay attention and take it seriously. And he's like, I've never had that happen before. I've heard it and of other people having those kinds of experiences, but I personally never had a paranormal experience. And he's like, I can't tell you why, but I know it was paranormal in nature. So I thought that was a really interesting story. And it reminds me that they interact with us all the time. So our next story is one of those stories that just is classic. Years ago, I was doing a radio show for somebody, and the guy that was hosting the show was a disc jockey. This is back in, I don't even know if they do live radio many places anymore. I think it's all pretty much canned. But anyway, he was talking to me and he said about all these things. And he said, I'm buying a house. My wife thinks I'm crazy, but I want to buy this house. And there was a murder in the house. Do you think that's going to cause me any problems? And I'm like, well, I don't honestly know the answer to that. It depends. And he's like, well, I don't believe in that stuff. So, I'm going to go ahead and buy the house. My wife doesn't want to live there, but I think she'll get over it. And yeah. But anyway, this story very much reminded me of that. So this is a story by the daughter of a man who bought a house where they knew something bad had happened. And she said her father and her mother found this house. It was really cheap. It's a classic story. It was really cheap compared to what it should be worth. And they bought the house. They ended up moving in with their 3 kids. And the kids are all like early to mid-teens. They have there's 3 bedrooms in the house. So the 2 girls share a bedroom. The boys has his own room, and the parents, of course, have the master bedroom. And the whole time they were living in the house, the everybody else in the house seemed to be fine. Even the one sister seemed to be fine, but the other girl, she said that from the very beginning she would feel like something was wrong, and she would feel somebody watching. She would feel somebody standing at the foot of her bed as though they were looking at her sleeping. That's a very disconcerting feeling. It doesn't sound all that dramatic, but I have to tell you, I've lived through that feeling. And there's something highly frightening about waking up in the middle of the night to see a figure standing at the foot of your bed, and then they just fade away. So anyway, she's trying to tell her parents there's something wrong with the house. She doesn't like it. Why do we have to stay here? And her parents are like, dude, there's nothing wrong. Just chill. And then one day she's talking to a neighbor who stopped her along the street. She recognized her as a neighbor about 3 houses down. And the lady was walking along with her groceries. So the girl offered to help her carry the stuff. She was an elderly lady. And the elderly lady said to her, oh, I hope you like that house that you just moved into. And she said, yeah, it's okay. She's like, it was a beautiful house. And the lady that lived there was so nice. She's like, oh, did you know the lady? She said, oh, I knew the whole family. And she's like, oh, that's nice. Was she, you said she was a nice lady. What happened to them? She's like, oh, that, honey, you don't want to know. So, of course, when someone tells you you don't want to know something, you want to know it.
Of course.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
So the girl begins digging, and she starts looking up the address and stuff. She eventually finds out that the house was owned by a man who was very abusive to his wife, and he would beat on her quite frequently. There's no record of whether he attacked the children or not. But she said when they pulled up the carpet in my bedroom, there was a 6 foot long, 2 foot wide piece of flooring that had been removed and replaced with newer raw flooring. And I had found a newspaper article that said she had died in the house. And it didn't say she had died of natural causes. They were very careful to be circumspect. But when she got older, she went and she did some more research. And she said, I found that the house had belonged to this man, that there was a court case, but most of the records were not open to be able to be seen. But what I did learn is that she died of blunt force trauma. And she's like, I know I could be imagining it because I can't prove that this is what happened to her, but I know she was beaten to death in my bedroom. And she said, I'm so glad that my parents finally decided the house wasn't for us. They would never admit anything was wrong. But if you go to the trouble of buying a house, you plan to stay in it a while. And in a year and a half, her parents sold the house to someone else and moved.
Yeah, there really aren't many cases of natural blunt force trauma.
Yeah, I mean, the best you could come off was if she fell down the steps or something like that. But even then, it's not, I don't know if they would call that blunt force trauma.
Well, it would be accidental and not natural causes. But
anyhow, it was an interesting story. And really, I think one of the reasons it caught my attention was because years and years ago, there's a business in the area we live in, and there's a hotel there. Now, the hotel is a misnomer. It is actually what they used to call a row house. Philadelphia is filled with them. Some of the eastern part of the state's filled with them. I believe New York City has a huge amount of these. They're basically a city block wide structure that is broken up into individual residences and businesses. And in this one, today, there is a restaurant and bar on the first floor. The second floor, the last I had heard, was used for storage. And I happened to stumble into that business just as they were beginning to open up. And the bartender that was there the day I was there, I stopped to have dinner with a friend. He recognized my name because I'm from that area, and said, they weren't busy. And he said, I really need to talk to somebody. Maybe I can talk to you. Being the ghost lady, sometimes that happens. So he sits down at the table with us for a little bit and begins to tell me that the staff there were having a lot of paranormal experiences. They were definitely having experiences in the basement of the property where the where you would put the change the kegs of beer and what have you, and there was storage down there, you know, for supplies. But he said the biggest issue was up on the second floor. Now, he didn't rent that second floor. In fact, it wasn't habitable in a lot of respects. But as the staff would be working, they would hear a woman upstairs and she would be calling out. And they could never make out what she was saying, but she definitely was calling out. So he did a little research and he found that the house, that this property, this piece of the property, had been owned by a guy who had had I believe it was a candy store there. And then after that, he had, over the years, he had switched it and did something more lucrative. So it ended up being a bar. And the guy who ran the bar, who bought the property at that point and ran the bar, his wife was bedridden. And he would work downstairs all day. And if she needed something, she would ring a bell. And if he wouldn't come, she would yell for him. You can imagine, you know, he's downstairs working and she's ringing the bell. He knows she needs something, but you can't just tell a customer, my wife has to go to the potty. So he would try to work his way through the process and then go upstairs. And so when it would get desperate, she would yell out for him. And they hear her to this day yelling it out, his name. His nickname was Eagle. And I don't know why. I don't know how that happened, but everything you ever read about this property refers to him as Eagle. And I've never found a real first name. Even maybe it was his first name because it was on the deeds. But the staff there insisted they heard people walking upstairs. There was nobody up there. There was, as the way the property is built, you can look in from the building across the street and you have a direct view into the second floor of this old bar restaurant. And on several occasions, people came over that were working on remodeling the building across the street and asked this guy, when did you get tenants in here? I thought you told me it wasn't ready to rent. And he's like, I didn't. And they're like, well, no, we saw a woman upstairs when we were working on the second floor. She waved to us in the window. I don't know if that was the wife or not, but the place still exists. It's still a restaurant bar. You know, it still exists. So they're still having, I've been in there probably about a year ago was the last time I was there. And the new owner, because it's traded hands a couple times, but a new owner actually told me that they're still having activity in the place. And I wrote about it in one of my books. If you're interested and you want to find out more about it, I'm just being a little circumspect because I don't know that the new owners want that reputation.
Well, I don't know. It seems like nowadays people really embrace that because they probably think it drives more business.
To be honest with you, overall, from what I understand, if you have a house that's haunted, it knocks the price down. If you have a business that's haunted, it'll raise the price. Plus, you get a lot of people that are interested in the paranormal who want to eat in a haunted spot for whatever the reason. I've done literally 5,000 stories over my lifetime, and I'm told all the time that people would come in, and particularly a few years ago when the books first started to come out, and they would have the book bent open to their story, and they go, this is the place, right? I really want to eat in this place. And they're like, yeah, this is the place. The Jean Bonnet Tavern has told me that many times. So that's one of the places I wanted to talk about. And it's just an interesting place. It's a beautiful place if anybody ever gets to go there. It's on Route 764 going into Altoona. And it's a beautiful little restaurant just as you're coming into the Altoona from the little village of El Dorado.
Oh, you probably don't even have to tell me now.
I know I don't have to tell you now. I threw some clues out there for locals. But yeah, that's the place. And from the moment the guy bought it and began to remodel it, there's been stuff. There's a feeling of somebody watching you in the basement, stuff like that. But the majority of the stories are about the second floor, hearing walking upstairs, hearing voices upstairs, people seeing a woman looking out the window. So it's an interesting little place. So the next story I wanted to tell was of a place called St. Mary's of the Woods College in Terre Haute, Indiana. Now, it's a beautiful college. There's a hall there called Foley Hall. And Foley Hall has the art department on the third floor. It was built in 1860. It has been written about extensively through the years, and it has an interesting history of hauntings. So, as I said, it was built in 1860. It was opened as a St. Mary's Institute at one point, and then it became St. Mary's of the Woods College. It was built in 3 stages. The north portion in 1860, the east and west wings were added in 1871, and there's a courtyard because the way they build it, there's like a 3-sided building, and so there's a courtyard there. And it was completed in 1897. It was that part was torn down in 1989. And there are so many stories of this of this particular building and what happened there, that I just thought it was fascinating. I wanted to share it. So during 1931 to 1964, there was a nun who worked there. Her name was Sister Esther Newport. She taught art in the art department. She loved to paint and was apparently a phenomenal artist. And she had an interesting set of stories to tell about. There were an interesting set of stories to tell about her. So how I should probably say it. So his Sister Esther started there, as I said, was a young nun, and she very quickly began to realize that there was something wrong with the art department. You can imagine, being up there painting, working on a project, or, grading artwork or doing whatever she's doing, setting up plans for the next day. And it's late in the evening, and all of a sudden you get this feeling you're not alone, or a canvas flips off of flips to the ground, or different things that occurred. So early in the 1930s, this is how all the articles put it. They always say there were some troubles in Foley, and people began to be afraid to go there. Sister Esther spoke to the Mother Superior, Mary Benedict, and the Mother Superior and the Superior General at the time, and they decided that they would hold a mass in the third floor to send on the ghosts of Foley, is how it's put. So basically what the stories are is that there was a nun who had worked there in the early 1900s. She passed away of natural causes.
Again.
She fell sick and passed away. And she had taught art to the girls at the college, and she's never left. But here's the interesting part of the narrative. She has no face.
Okay.
There's no reason why. She did leave, by the way, a painting of herself, a self-portrait of herself. And I thought at first they were going to tell me there was no face. She never finished the face, but that's not true. It was there, and it was completely finished. But Sister Esther said that there were several times throughout her time at Foley that she had come across things that manifested. And she said, one of them was one night she was working up in the front of the second floor in the chapel, which is the floor below the third floor where the art area is. Suddenly it got cold, and she turned around to look. She just had this feeling she was being watched. She said, and I saw a girl who was working in the big room from the art department. She came around the hall and went down the hall towards the next room, where I knew there was a young lady working. Her name was Isabel. She was working on an art project while I was doing other things on the second floor. She said, I saw this woman stand outside the doorway, and I thought, this must be Isabel, because we were supposed to be the only 2 people in the building. So I said to her, Isabel, what's the matter with you? You look disturbed. Or are you just frozen out because it's cold up there? And Isabel, from behind her, said, I'm sick and tired of that nun coming around. I left. Sister Elizabeth asked her who the nun was, and Isabel said, I don't know, because she always stands between me and the light. I can never see her face. And she leaves when I ask her who she is. So I don't know. And she said, I thought at first it must have just been a bothersome older nun who was puttering around up there. But over the years, I've learned that it's not. She said that another story was of two other young, Catherine and Anna, who one morning around 11 were in the art department with Sister Esther, and they were cleaning things up and getting ready for the next class. She said that at that point, Catherine asked if they had seen the sister who had been looking in the door at them, and the other girl and Sister Esther said no, they had it, and she said, well, this nun was very odd. She had pleats down the front of her uniform dress, and none of the nuns, their habits didn't, their dress wear didn't have pleats in it. And she said, I thought that was kind of interesting because I'd never seen any clothing with the pleats in it. But later on, as she was looking through documents, she came across a photograph from the early 1900s, and indeed the nuns' costumes or dress wear had pleats in it at that time. And she said I went and I asked Catherine and Anna if they had ever seen any of the women on this photograph, and they said no, but the pleats look very familiar. When did these pictures get taken? And she said, oh, a long time ago. And through the years, there have been a lot of stories of this girl being seen. So the main consensus is that it's a woman by the name of Sister Celestine. She was known to be very fond of working in the art department. She was from a group of nuns that came in from Texas and worked there. And they described her as a funny looking sister, and others have seen her on another occasion. Same Catherine was working upstairs when she said, I think you're going to think I'm crazy, Sister Esther, but there was a sister who just walked through the door and she had no face. Well, she played it down and what have you, not wanting to cause it to be difficult. But on many occasions, this woman appeared, whoever she was. On another day, Sister Esther talks about she had a class up there. She was, they were doing, painting. This class was up there doing sketches and painting. And she said one of the girls in the class raised her hand and she said, Sister Esther, which nun are we supposed to be sketching? And she said, what do you mean, which nun? And she said, well, Sister Esther, there's two up there. And she said, I looked and I saw nothing. But two of the other girls said, yes, Sister Esther, there's a nun up there. And strangely, her features don't seem to be very clear. And so this is going on for quite a while. There are stories of rooms being lit up when there were no lights in them, and mostly you see her either heading down the hallway in front of you, or if she's behind you, you turn to look at her, she'll look up, there's no face, but you see her head go up as though she's looking at you, and she just fades away. And there are literally probably 50 stories of this sister appearing out of nowhere. And I just thought it was an interesting story. You don't hear that very often. And there's no reason that anybody can come up with why she would have no face. But apparently, that is how she chooses to manifest. I've always found it fascinating when they don't have faces or they're missing their feet or things like that. I don't know what makes them not be able to manifest entirely. But
my thought when you were saying that was that if they said she was funny looking, that she was very sensitive about it, and when she manifested herself, she said, well, I guess you're not going to see my face.
That might be. That's very interesting. That's kind of cool. Yeah, I can see that. I hadn't thought of that. So our next story is about an inherited house. So this young woman tells the story of in the 1960s, her grandparents had bought a home, and when they passed away around the year 2000, they willed the home to her. This was a godsend. She was a single mom with a little boy, and she was struggling to keep up the rent and what have you. So you can imagine how excited she was to now be the owner of a home. And so she moved in. She said, on her very first night, I began to think that something was wrong when my son walked up the stairs and said to me, Mama, who was that guy that walked up the stairs behind you? She had been one up ahead of him. And she said, I turned around and I saw nothing. I asked him what he meant. He said, oh, never mind. He smiled at me. After that, the child talked about seeing this man on multiple occasions. And she thought at first it was her grandfather, which makes a lot of sense. And she said, but my son kept saying to me, no, he's older. He's a teenager. And she said, I had no idea who this could be. But when I was going through a bunch of old documents and stuff, I found out that my grandparents had an older son who had lived in the house. And at the age of 16, apparently he had been playing Russian roulette with some friends upstairs. And it didn't work out so well for him. And he shot himself in the house. And she's like, over the years, he was barely ever mentioned. I really didn't know his story at all, just that he had passed. But by doing research and reading a bunch of old documents, I came to understand what had happened. And I showed my son a picture of him that I found amongst my grandparents' possessions. And that photograph, my son immediately identified as, oh, that's the man that follows you through the house, Mama. He seems to really like you. It would have been her uncle. I thought that was really interesting because she really had no idea. She had heard a name and that was pretty much it. As a child growing up, and very rarely at all. But apparently he was excited about having his niece in the house. And so and she said, as a haunting goes, it's nothing to write about. It's just my son grew up watching this man. And she's like, and I don't know why, but I never got to see him. I only would know when my son would say, Mama, the man's beside you again, or what have you. And I would always tell him, you're welcome to stay here as long as I own the house. So normally I don't do really famous stories because everybody already knows them, but I wanted to end this episode with a kind of famous story. I have been fascinated with Lizzie Borden forever, since I was like a little girl. And we all know this, the old saw, the rhyme, if you will. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her father 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her mother 41. And I have to tell you, I personally have never believed she did it. I don't know why, but I just never did. I could tell you, my rationales, but just a gut instinct. So for those who aren't aware, just in case there are folks who don't know who Lizzie Borden was, in August of 1892, Andrew and Abby Borden were found dead in the house they lived in Fall River, Massachusetts. The father was axed to death in the living room. There's a very famous photograph of that. His wife was apparently changing the sheets in the one bedroom upstairs when someone came up behind her with an axe and did the same thing to her. She was more mangled than the father. And she was not Lizzie's mother. She was Lizzie's stepmother. There was a lot of animosity between Lizzie and her sister and the stepmother. There was a lot of controlling behavior, but it was a Victorian era. So a lot of that you could, put off to the time frame, the morals of that era, that sort of thing. And there have been every kind of theory under the sun, from Lizzie stripped buck naked and went upstairs and murdered both of her parents and then ran down to the basement, washed up, put the dress on, and pretended to help to find them. To it was a Jewish man going through the neighborhood. Yep, there was a time in history. Apparently, it's always a time in history when Jewish families get blamed for stuff. There's no validity to it. The best we can come up with was a salesman in the area at that day, and he stopped at the house and spoke to the maid. What his nationality was or his religion, nobody knows. And that the uncle murdered her, that she murdered her father out of anger because he molested her. There's just 1,000, and none of these theories have any proof to them. None. So it's really difficult to give you any answers. But she went on trial rather than her sister, and the only real evidence was that she found the bodies, and that a couple days later she burned a dress in the cook stove, saying that the dress had paint all over it, and so she couldn't get the paint out. She got rid of it. So that's the entirety of all of that. However, since the paranormal world has gotten so famous and popular, people are literally lining up to wait to rent the Lizzie Borden house to ghost hunt. I have never been there. I think that when you pick a stigmatized property and you market it this way, that a lot of times what you do is you invite crap in. So I really never paid a lot of attention to the house because I just think that if there's anything there, I don't know why it would be Lizzie or her stepmother or her father. I just don't, there's no evidence to prove that it is. However, there are consistent stories. I mean, tons of them from the guests that are there. Now, again, I'm going to say be mindful of the fact that these are people that are there to have a paranormal experience. So some of them are probably very, very professional, and some of them are there just to goof off or whatever, but just to be aware of the fact that suggestion might come to play. But the guests there tell the staff that they hear laughing and playing in the middle of the night, things moving around, that they discover things scattered across the room when no one's in the bedrooms, that pictures will fall at your feet, that there's no explanation for them because the strings are still in the back of the picture or the hooks. That on the anniversary of the death of Andrew and Lizzie, some people came to stay, and they felt, the tour guides that stayed with them that night felt piercing pain in their left eyes, the same spot where Andrew Borden was struck with the axe first. And there's just a lot of stories of objects moving, people hearing voices in rooms and going in and there's no one there, a lot of that sort of thing. And I have to say that it's really an interesting story. The murder itself is an interesting story because Lizzie was acquitted, and yet though community considered her guilty, and she moved to a nearby town and then stayed there the rest of her life with her sister and lived with her sister quietly. But they say that the nursery rhyme that I just said at the beginning of the story was actually something that kids would chant at her. She went down the street and they would jeer at her because their parents were convinced that she had committed the murders. And I have to say, none of the activity appears to be anywhere near what you would have expected. I would have thought of her being more, she was a quiet woman, I understood, very demure. And that time frame, her father was very strict. The stepmother was, from all accounts I've ever heard, there was a lot of problems because she was strict and she didn't really want the girls there, but the girls were spinsters. And so in that time frame, the stepmother had to kind of like suck it up and let them stay. It would have been expected of the family at that point in time. And so none of the stories of the hauntings make a whole lot of sense to me based upon the family's history, but there they are. They're still there. Now, is it Lizzie? Is it the mother, the father? Is it Emma? Is it the maid who stayed for a while? I don't know who it is, but it's an interesting set of mysteries, and it would be really interesting to find out exactly who says they're there. But then again, don't forget, ghosts don't have to tell you the truth. They can lie. And with that, I'm going to end this episode and wish everybody a good night.
All right. Good night. And you'll have to say it again now because you get the last word.
Oh, okay. And so I wish you all a good night again.
And Ghost Lady of PA. Let's start that over again.